and welcome to the history lessons in Edupedia World. Today I want to go into the subject of who writes history. We've heard many times that it's the winners who write the history. There's a quote from Chinua Achebe that says, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." And we have an example of this in what happened in Spain after the Civil War. In previous lessons, we've been able to see horrors that happened during the Civil War in Spain. Today we'll get a glimpse of what happened after the war during the dictatorship, specifically in the subject we're working on history. Education was a big pillar in how to indoctrinate and work the ideals of the dictatorship into the population. Winners do write the history, and you'll see that all this that we're talking about today still has a big impact, even nowadays. It had a great impact, and that obviously comes back to the population even years and years after the fact. But let's go into exactly what happened after the Civil War and the uprising of fascism in Spain. They will use education as a tool to manipulate the population. After the instauration of the dictatorship, they made sure to keep the status quo by all means possible. So they changed what subjects, or what the material and the information, the curricula of all the subjects taught in schools. Also they changed the teachers, as we'll see. History is one of the subjects they'll put more emphasis in. We'll have religion as a base for all this. This is the legitimacy of all this will go through the will of God. But there'll also be a military or civil service for everyone. Let me say that this is a big change, because during the Second Republic, education had started to change. This is some transformative times in Europe, and Spain during the Republic was one of the pioneers for many new methods of schooling and changing the way children were educated, trying to find better ways. Here, it completely goes backwards. We have parts of the education that were completely dedicated to the alzamiento, or the liberation war as they called it. They portrayed the alzamiento like a movement to save the country from the chaos that had started to dominate the territory. What they did was introduce the idea, that will be repeated throughout, that from the 18th century to 1936 there was this black mark where the anti-Spanish enemy had taken the country hostage. They demonize the time of the Second Republic, using always adjectives that would make them the opponent, the anti-Spanish, the enemy, the evil, the foreigners, although they weren't foreign. The justification that they give is that there had been lots of opposition coming from the Spanish people that had been loyal to traditions and ideals, and they were against what they blamed as French liberalism. To make sure that this version of history was the imposed one, during the dictatorship they tried to eradicate any reminiscence from the Republic. They changed teachers for ideologically favorable ones. These were normally former soldiers with basically war merits that simply took then the work of public servants. This wasn't prepared people. These weren't teachers that had had a training to work as such. This was just old soldiers. On the education level, this meant that all the innovation that the Second Republic had brought in was eradicated, and they went back to basically the 7th century with simple methods of data memorization and repeating what had been said by the teacher. This way, really, what was important wasn't the acquisition of knowledge to then apply to a later position. It was just get some information, and next thing you'll just be working in some simple business. It's not needed for people to think. To make these modifications, in 1954 they passed a law where they organized schooling curriculum in methods, or let's say groups of knowledge. Specifically, the Article 37 in history and geography is where it gets integrated into the group of formation of the national spirit. I think we can get an idea on how these changes might mark a difference in the way you teach history, as we'll see. The objective of history for them was, and I quote in Spanish, la revalorización de lo español, la definitiva, la extirpación del pesimismo antihispánico y extranjerizantes, pureza moral de la nacionalidad española. It's the revalorization, giving a new value to what is Spanish, the removal of pessimism. It's referring to everyone was quite depressed after a war. They wanted to eradicate that too. They didn't want anything that they called anti-Hispanism. They didn't want anyone questioning what they were doing to Spain. Anything that questioned that meant that you were anti-Spanish and you had foreign ideas. What they wanted to do with history is create the moral purity of a Spanish nationality in their heads. To give an example, these were the conditions for a book to be able to be published during the regime. It had to have suppression of historical pictures that didn't adhere with the new regime. Historical figures had to have some connection with patriotism, or at least the church, every historical figure that was quoted. They could not have any intolerance against Catholic religion, and any other religion was suppressed from the curricula. There's no positive references to democratic institutions, big, strong references to tradition, and no, by all means, no positive validation of the Republic. From now on, it was a synonym of chaos and anarchy. This new history that was taught in schools, it was used to justify all this by divine designation and the constitution and patriotism in Spain. This way, what they did, they integrated the identification of Spain and of being Spanish with Catholicism. You had the two ideals go together and could not be taken apart. The three main values that they were trying to sip in and make mandatory were patriotism, nation, and religion. But also to spread these ideals and attitudes and to ensure the work of the nation under the dictatorship. They didn't want people rising up. This was actually applied to all subjects, some more than others, as we're going to see in history. But for example, I've taken a language exercise, and they have this grammatical analysis that said the national uprising was necessary because the disastrous situation in which Spain had been in was not solvable by pacific means. This is a sentence that the children had to analyze grammatically. Even here, they got their agenda. But it was in history where there was more of a detailed manipulation of the facts and the main personalities to transmit clear and concrete image that reflected the ideals and conceptions of Spain, and that many, I say many, still keep today to a certain point. For instance, the Muslim history of Spain was completely eradicated. There's 500 years with nothing, because they weren't Catholic. They used religion as glue. In the first place, what they did was create some school programs, and in these programs you had values of significance given to situations and historical figures. What I mean is that they designated meaning and specific value to every historical figure or event that would give them a link to the ideology of the dictatorship. And only under these conditions were they allowed to be quoted in history books. The way that they sorted and adapted to the needs of the regime figures like the Cid. This was a famous fighter during medieval times against the Moors, the Muslims in Spain. He actually worked for various governors of Muslim cities. He was more of a mercenary. He wasn't only fighting for his faith. He then went to serve Christian kings, but he'd been for years with Muslim rulers, and this was obviously not mentioned. Then you had the Catholic kings that you might have heard about if you've done European history. They were the monarchs that kicked out Jewish people from the peninsula and then Muslims. The idea was to keep religion as a base, but they used religion also for their own needs. Religion at that point in time was the only thing that people in the Hispanic Peninsula had in common, so that's how they used it. But it was never given in context. What they wanted to do with all these figures was transmit the Spanish morality that they favored. The national splendor and Catholic religion were at the center of the discourse. They considered that they defended Spain from its enemies. These historical figures were fighting for Spain, so they did the same as General Franco. They assimilate the figure of General Franco with all these famous historical figures. They will always associate the figure with religion to reinforce its legitimacy. It was said the people were waiting for the arrival of the dictator, shouting, "Arriba España! Viva Cristo Rey!" This means up Spain, or hooray for Spain, and Christ King. They were simulating a religious figure to the dictator. They also defended that those who fought and died for his cause. They gave blood for God and the mother country. In this way, the young minds were told that the fascist project was something they had to be grateful for, that it had saved them from this terrible previous situation that did not coincide with divine providence. After being affiliated to the regime, the military training and military or civil service started being mandatory for children older than 7. They had, obviously, mild training, but it was basically indoctrination. Schooling was made mandatory for all the population. This meant that, yes, everyone had schooling, but it was mandatory. Only primary. Secondary school, where people get a more deep formation, was sparse and basically privatized only for the elite. Secondary school was transformed into only social promotion that could be accessed by those that could pay, and basically only the male sons. Obviously, the Catholic Church played a big part in keeping the regime as the pillar of authority, and because of this right, they were able to be the ones that had the monopoly on teaching and the schools. Most schools were religious. And thanks to this, they got explanations from divine right, like this one that we've got here. Con la guerra de liberación quedó salvada España y el sentido cristiano de la vida frente a la perversión de las fuerzas del mal. Meaning Spain was saved with the liberation war and Christian sense won before perversion and evil. For them, there were 7 enemies of Spain that were taught in schools: liberalism, democracy, Judaism, Masonry, capitalism, separatism, referring to the Basque and the Catalan nations that have different identities and consider themselves different nations, and both of them are still fighting to be a nation of their own. And of course, they were against also Marxism that was associated to the Second Republic. As I was mentioning, the Basque and the Catalan people, the regime abolished their regional government bodies, and they enacted measures against the use of Basque and Catalan languages. Both languages were banned, and up to this day you have still lots of people that were schooled during Franco times that can speak their local languages, Catalan or Basque, because the parents or grandparents spoke them in those languages, but they have had as adults to go to classes to learn how to write their own language, or they just cannot. Also Basque, after Franco's time, got ahead during the transition, and it wasn't mandatory in all Basque schools, so that language has actually receded a lot. There was also further contrast between the Popular Front government, the Franco regime was, because the liberal leftists were basically working class. Those were the elements of society. But those that had supported the Popular Front, Franco, they were the conservative upper classes that were staying in the mainstay with Franco's government. They were the ones that got benefited from this dictatorship. Above all, Franco endeavored to remove all vestiges of any parliamentary democracy. For him, as we've mentioned before, he perceived this to be alien to Spanish political traditions. He outweighed political parties, blaming them from the chaotic conditions that had preceded the civil wars. They eliminated universal suffrage. They limited the freedom and expression of everyone, and they viewed criticism of the regime as treason. And if you were charged with criticizing the regime, and so obviously was treason, you were likely to die. And many did end up being shot because of this. Even to this day, we have to mention that there were Spanish politicians still alive that had signed death sentences from the dictatorship. And just another example of the job they did is this monument that we see here. This monument is still in Spain. It's called El Valle de los Caídos. There's still this monument in Spain. It's called El Valle de los Caídos. It's a valley of the fallen. It's a Catholic basilica, and it is in the town of San Lorenzo de El Escorial near Madrid, and it is a monumental memorial that was conceived by Francisco Franco in honor to bury those who fell fighting for what he called his glorious crusade during the Spanish Civil War. The monument is meant to be a national act of atonement and reconciliation now, but the Valley of the Fallen is the surviving monument of Franco's rule and has him buried inside. The most of its construction, it's quoted in different places, but from 1943, the number of prisoners who worked on the site is being told that reached 600. Yes, you heard correctly. Prisoners of war built this. Some sources even claim that up to 20,000 prisoners were used overall in this construction. This was forced labor that took place. There was basic slavery, and many people are known to have died building this construction, this monument, and many did not return. It's been said in Spanish tradition that many were just put into the walls of this monument. Here, as I've said, there's the tomb of Francisco Franco, And still to this day, it's been closed and opened, but now it's still open. And Francoists and people can still go there and hint in their nostalgia for the times of the dictatorship. This is equivalent of having a place of worship in some concentration camp. This is a monument to fascism that is still in its own context. It hasn't been transformed, and people still visit it continuously. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson. This was the ending for the lessons that we've been working on the civil war that was in Spain during 1936 to 1939. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and see you in the next one.